I'd like to introduce our two speakers for today. So Louise Butler, 20 years experience of working in health and social care, including NHS, local authority, and also third sector services. And she began her career as a nurse, moved into substance misuse and dual diagnosis services, but for the last 6 years has led change programs, including QA, community engagement, and organisational development, but always with a focus on safeguarding adults. So Louise has a particular interest in the challenges of collaborative working, and she has a master's degree from Keele in law and policy, with a specialism in safeguarding adults. And she's quite well published, as you may know, in terms of making safeguarding personal. Chloe, our second speaker, is antisocial behaviour caseworker for Westminster Council. And she's got a background in psychology and has worked extensively in the probation service, including as a court probation officer at the Central Criminal Court. And in her current role, she takes a victim-centred, multi-agency management approach to addressing residential and street-based antisocial behaviour. And just to say, I work with Louise in a number of capacities, but I work with Louise and Chloe on a multi-agency task force in Westminster. And, you know, I can absolutely say that the quality of their thinking, the multidisciplinary approach that they take is quite inspirational. So I'm absolutely delighted that they're here with us today to share their insights on when a home becomes a drug space and what to do about cuckooing. So we'll share the slides now, and over to Louise and Chloe.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Hardly recognise myself there. Sometimes I pinch myself and I wonder quite how I've got to this stage. But anyway, I'm here and I'm ready.
Because you're good.
So look, I think more important than me is actually Chloe Higginson, who's actually the one who will actually tell you more about what's actually going on locally. But what I'd like to do, so if you could move on to the first slide, please, is to, you know what, if you just Google cuckooing, there are many number of definitions. There's not one definition at all. It talks about criminals targeting homes of vulnerable adults to be used for drug dealing. It talks about country lines, which if you sit within child protection, you're probably more familiar with, when homes are overtaken, probably just for a short amount of time in order for a criminal activity to take place. But I think for me, the most important thing to look for is a definition which actually talks of people who take over a person's nest or their property to actually facilitate exploitation. And that's really what we're talking about here. So we're not necessarily having a focus just upon drug gangs taking over people's homes, because as you begin to hear Chloe and myself speak, you'll realise that actually a typical victim is not a typical victim at all. So that's really the first thing I wanted to say. So look, today's focus is about what we're doing about it in Westminster locally, and how come we are working collaboratively together. Chloe is going to actually talk through signs around what it might be you could be looking out for, what a typical victim might look like. We're going to look at a little bit of data. We're going to look at current practice. We're going to look at a little bit of law. And then we're going to really look at some key principles around how Chloe and myself and the group that Judith talked about, how we're all going to be getting together, or are getting together, to have a collaborative approach to join up the enforcement of cuckooing, and have actually a more personalised response towards these vulnerable people. And then we've got a couple of case studies at the end, which we hope that will resonate, maybe hopefully with some of you, and then we're going to look at next steps. So that's really what it's all about. I believe that questions will be fielded towards the end, and I'm going to let Judith and her team do that one. So without further ado, I'm going to let's kick straight on into the next slide. So how come we're sort of where we are today? So back in about 2017, the Safer Westminster Partnership, which looks at community protection, first identified that there were concerns with repeat victimization of older people. So older people is, technically speaking, somebody over the age of 60. But we can talk about that in a minute, because the definition in itself is problematic. And while there's still limitations with collecting police data, what they did is they actually came to adult safeguarding. We actually triangulated some data to actually, and we were quite surprised by the fact that there was a very large percentage, probably about 67% of safeguarding cases where there was a criminal element to them. And we really felt that that should be addressed. So the recommendation is that the safeguarding, which actually join up with this other directorate, to have a collaborative approach and to have a look at a task and finish group through a community safety lens and see how we could support vulnerable people. Now, what we actually began to focus in on, quite rightly to begin with, was really, with support from trading standards, was financial abuse. And we began to tease apart what scamming was taking place, what fraudulent activity was taking place in terms of financial abuse. And we've actually identified wards in the borough at the top end of the borough, which will come as no surprise to those who know Westminster, and the bottom end. But as we were having conversations, it became quite apparent that cuckooing was becoming a problem as well. And I first met Chloe in one of these meetings, which I think Chloe would probably say it was only probably about 9 or 10 months ago now. And Chloe started with great enthusiasm to actually begin to put pressure upon myself and upon the group to actually begin to look at cuckooing in a lot more detail. So that's really how come we got to where we are today. I think it's Chloe's determination to really make us have a look at this. Coupled with all of this, actually last year, a report came out by the police and the CPS, the Crime Prosecution Service, which actually was called the Poor Relation, and it did actually identify that responses to crimes against older people was really something we needed to look at. Now, they define an older person as being 60 years old. Older people defined by age concern are 50 years old. So we've already got a slight issue when it comes to legal interventions around who is actually an older person, and whether actually they're going to take forward, as you will see in a minute, any legal enforcement upon these situations. So I'm going to pass you on to Chloe now, who's going to talk a little bit about what the data looks like from an antisocial behaviour perspective. So Chloe.
Okay, so as Louise was just saying, in the task and finish groups that we were involved in, it was quite hard to determine how cuckooing was I guess affecting the borough, because there isn't much data on it. There isn't really much data on it. I mean, there's a little bit of research here and there, but there's not much on it nationally. So what I decided to do was look back through the cases in my team. So my team's quite small in the council, but we deal with all the antisocial behaviour cases that come through that are high risk. So any that are deemed to have a cuckooing element to them would usually come through to us. So I think I went back, because we've got a new system, so I went back about 3 years And from the data that I could find, I determined that the majority of the cuckooing cases that we have dealt with or that have come through to us are usually male and single occupant households. I'm not sure that I've ever come across a cuckooing case actually where there's kind of two individuals in the house. Interestingly, the average age of the person in this data set who were being cuckooed was 50 years old, which actually, even having worked on a lot of these cases in the past, I probably wouldn't have guessed that it was people who were around that age. I probably would have said maybe about 30 to 40. But that was quite interesting that it was a lot higher than most of us in the meeting thought it would be. All of them were social housing properties. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in private tenancies, but it's much more likely to happen in social housing. And then the majority of the individuals who had been cuckooed had vulnerabilities, and these usually were a combination of mental health problems and or substance or alcohol misuse. Interestingly as well, most of them were known to services in the borough. However, there was varied engagement between those individuals. So it could be that someone might well be known to mental health services. However, being current and being known doesn't necessarily mean that they are talking to their coordinators about what's going on in their lives. So it might just be that they, for example, I remember one case who he just received his depot injection and that was it. And it was quite hard for the care coordinators to engage with him any further than that. So that's kind of where we started and what was going on in Westminster. As I say, that was just from our ASB team. So it might be that there were, and I think Louise and I will cover this further on, is that there might be cuckooing cases that kind of fall between the cracks. And so these are the ones that have been high risk and usually have gone on to require maybe a closure order or definitely multi-agency input to try and resolve the issues. So I think, can we go on to the next slide, please? So just moving on from that, so typical signs of when cuckooing is happening, as I said before, it's typically or most likely to occur in social housing blocks or houses. Residents who report might report comings and goings. A lot of these they're very short visits. So and people or residents may describe these individuals who are visiting as kind of unsavory looking characters. Maybe they might look homeless or they might look like they're Class A drug users. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got maybe that coupled with a lot of youths who are attending the address. But the short visits are because people will go pick up what they need and leave. That may also include exchanges taking place. So a lot of the time, if it's a social housing block or estate, exchanges might take place on the doorstep or in the courtyard, or maybe just outside the gates. But residents, or if there's residents around, it becomes obvious that that's what's happening. Sometimes there can be increased cars. So if the property, I mean, we're talking about cuckooing is usually as a result of drug dealers taking over a vulnerable person's property. So the dealers may have hire cars or expensive cars, which may look very out of place, especially if those individuals then go into the flat that's being cuckooed. An increase in antisocial behaviour, so there'll be arguments in the courtyards. We've had lots of cases where there's actually been violence reported, you know, arguments over drugs or drug debts. And then one of the main complaints is drug use and drug paraphernalia being left around. And when in cases of really serious cuckooing, I've had residents reporting, you know, taking their kids down the stairs of the communal stairwell, taking them down on their way to school, and there's been needles left around, or there's foils and pipes, and then even people injecting on the stairs, which obviously is incredibly traumatic for other residents to witness, especially if they're young kids. Next slide, please. So as the ASB increases, and there'll be reports to the police from the local community, and the council, and the housing provider, we'd hope that all of those reporting pathways are used. In terms of the tenant, now the tenant may appear withdrawn, and if they had been engaged with support service, they might not engage. I've had residents talk about individuals who have been cuckooed as, oh, we haven't seen them in a while, you know, we haven't seen them for a few days, we don't really see them around. They used to be, you know, they would say hi to us and now they don't. So that's one aspect, or one way that the tenant could be impacted, as well as their property being sparse of valuables and in disrepair. A lot of the time dealers may take things, other drug users may take things, like a lot of the time they won't have a phone, which also means that support services find it more difficult to get in contact with them. So if they're constantly, their phones are being taken away, or their debit cards, that kind of stuff, to get their benefits. Quite common is the tenant won't have a key to their property. So other residents in the block or estate may see the tenant ringing or buzzing, trying to buzz themselves into their own property, which shows that they haven't got much control, or they've literally been taken over. And then when the tenant is interviewed, I've had it on a number of occasions where they're quite ambivalent about the situation. So they will constantly say that these visitors are their friends, and they don't want to get them in trouble, and they're very worried about, you know, anything happening to them. And that can be as a result of, you know, these individuals being isolated and lonely, but also the sort of befriending and manipulation that the dealers will use to get into their flats. Next slide. I think, Louise, did you just want to quickly say something about the title of this slide?
Okay, so when Chloe put some of these slides together, I initially looked at an adults at risk, and I just want to make it really clear here, and I am going to talk about eligibility in a minute, but we're looking at safeguarding in its widest context here. we're looking at safeguarding from a community perspective. It's not necessarily always the fact that that person, that adult, will actually be eligible for care and support needs within the local authority. But so I wanted to bring this to people's attention, that even though the terminology here, adults at risk, is one that we use, and it's actually written in the Care Act as well, for an adult who is at risk of abuse and neglect, Chloe has used it as also, and I think it's really important that we just clarify each other's terminologies. And in this sense, we are actually looking at a wider definition of safeguarding, away from just the statutory framework, because safeguarding, when it's done well, is about prevention. And I think a lot of the work that I would like to see occurring within this Cuckooing framework is around a prevention arm. So that's just, I just wanted to say that. Thank you, Chloe.
So the adults that we may see at risk, or who may be at risk in, I think, have we just gone on one slide too far? Sorry.
Yes.
I think there was one that says adults at risk who, yeah. Sorry, so if we just look at who might be at risk, I think I covered this looking at the data set from Westminster, but individuals who suffer from mental health issues and or a combination of substance misuse or alcohol misuse, they might have physical health problems, sex workers are also at risk due to their vulnerability, individuals with learning disabilities, if someone has financial issues or poverty, I think also you could probably include whether someone has a financial issue, could also be a drug debt, or incorporate that as well. Survivors of domestic violence and people who are lonely and isolated. And I think that links in quite well with what I said before about tenants being ambivalent and saying that these individuals are their friends. And that's seems to be quite key in a lot of the cases that I've worked on. And individuals with a chaotic lifestyle. Louise, did you want to say something?
There's a couple of things I just wanted to pick up. So from an adult social care perspective, we did find that in fact there were a few cases, not very many, with the person who actually had a learning disability. So I just wanted to draw that to your attention. Also, some of you might know, I actually work across both boroughs of Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea. Now, interestingly enough, in Kensington and Chelsea, we see a higher incident of mental health issues of those people who are cuckooed, who are over the age of 50, who are at the chronic stage of their mental health, where it's become reasonably stable in a chronic way. So you can see that even when you're working actually next door boroughs, you do get differences. And then the last thing I just wanted to draw your attention to is that when we talk about survivors of domestic abuse, we're not only talking about actually an intimate relationship, we're actually talking about familial abuse as well. So that's when abuse occurs and is by family members. And I'm pretty certain that one of our case studies actually talks about this. It's actually quite an interesting case study for us to have a look at. Thank you, Chloe.
No problem. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh no, I think it's, yeah, that one, thanks. So we've talked about who might be at risk. So this is more just quickly around how it happens. It's quite, what's the word? It's quite strategic. I mean, dealers will seek out these vulnerable people. It doesn't just, it's not a coincidence that it happens. They will hang around pharmacies, especially pharmacies that, or walk-in surgeries that give out scripts. I think there's one in particular I can think of in the south of Westminster, and also hostels as well. So they'll kind of hang around and seek out these individuals. And then they'll use grooming and exploitation. So it could be, you know, if they know that they can see that these individuals are lonely and isolated, it's, you know, befriending them, or giving them the tenant drugs or alcohol or money, and making the tenant feel important and special. So it could kind of be worked in that way, or it could just be pure pressure and duress and kind of instilling fear. You know, if you go to the police or the housing, then, you know, we will commit violence against you. So it's quite a complex process, I would say, but I don't actually know how long it takes, but I can imagine that it's relatively quick, given some of the cases that I've worked on. Louise, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I think that sounds clear to me. Thank you.
Could we have the next slide, please?
So I think I was going to just begin to talk a little bit here around the enforcement versus the making safeguarding personal approach, because I think Chloe has been trying to demonstrate that you have a very vulnerable client group that's not typical in terms of what it might be to be a victim. And you have some very crafty, clever, manipulative people who are engaging in that vulnerability in order to pursue their own needs, whether that's a criminal need or, as you'll see in the case studies, one of the case studies we have, that's more of a need actually around it was an accommodation need we have with one of the case studies, their family members forcing themselves into this lady's property who's got dementia and then just not leaving. So what's important here is that eligibility under a safeguarding referral is not actually relevant. So the person does not necessarily have to have care and support needs, even if the local authority is not funding for those needs, in order for a concern to be raised. It's what we then do in terms of decision making and thinking as to how we proportionately might take that concern forward, where we look at risk and we look at the environment and we look and we say to ourselves, well, what is it that safeguarding adults can do that's not being done already? And I think that's where Chloe's thinking and my thinking have begun to gel. And we've recognized that, yes, we can actually work collaboratively together on this with our respective departments, because in fact what we want, the outcomes we want, is to make sure that we both of us have a keen understanding about what actually the risk of neglect and abuse is, and the fact that we actually want to empower and support and engage and to perhaps really look at the well-being of that vulnerable person. Chloe mentioned the fact that these people can be very isolated. So what are we actually doing around that social isolation? How can we actually ensure that that what they're actually maybe sometimes getting out of these people invading their houses can actually be supplemented by something else? And so it's really clear that at the moment we have no clear multidisciplinary pathway at all. We are sitting in a new world of safeguarding in terms of modern slavery, human trafficking, in terms of COVID, really shining a light on what happens behind closed doors. We don't really know. We're not certain. I can tell you that we are having an increase in safeguarding concerns coming through, particularly from the police during COVID. We're in a bit of a new world at the moment. But the most important thing here is the fact that we really do need to work together in terms of the role that Chloe does with her at the exploitation unit with integrated gangs and safeguarding, to work out how we can build up a relationship with that person. And of course, advocacy, if the person has substantial difficulty in taking part, and we know that that doesn't necessarily mean they might lack decisional making capacity, it plays a hugely important role in this area. And then the last bullet point is the fact that there are no current legal powers specifically for cuckooing. Chloe has mentioned enforcement orders, but what I wanted to just very briefly talk about is the fact that there are actually a range of many other legal frameworks which actually can be pursued. And of course, these are really duties which, applied in different situations, need to be considered for each of these individual cases, such as the Mental Capacity Act, such as human rights, the Equality Act. So when you're dealing with these type of cases, you have to make sure you've got someone in the room who's got a keen understanding of what criminal, public and private law might look like. And then how do you act within a multidisciplinary framework to actually ensure that you're acting lawfully within the law, you are having a proportionate response as to how you might act, and you're acting fairly. And these are really challenging areas of work. And also, of course, there's other bits of law which are also available given the circumstances. We have the coercive and controlling behaviour, which is at the core of domestic abuse. And it's been used for the first time within the Serious Crime Act, 2015, to ensure that familial abuse is recognised. So it's really closed a gap in the law around patterns of behaviour intended to cause harm, and it's widened the definition of domestic abuse. So that's widened now away from just a one-to-one intimate relationship to now where families actually are abusive towards individual people. So what I've tried to do here in this slide is to clarify that, in fact, safeguarding can only work in partnership. It's absolutely looking at the well-being of that individual person. And even though a very clear criminal enforcement approach might be needed to be taken around a closure order, we need to work collaboratively together to support that adult, regardless if they've got care and support needs or not. And the next few slides show some thinking which we've begun to do to be one of the first boroughs to actually grapple with this from a policy perspective, and to see how we're actually going to be working with this client group and make it better for them. So should we have Chloe, did you want to come in at all on that slide before we move on to the next one?
Just very briefly to say that when we say there are no current legal powers or legislation, it just the closure order is, I think, what most people who work in my area would use, but my issue with it, I guess, is that it wasn't made specifically, or it wasn't introduced specifically for cuckooing. So it doesn't, the legislation doesn't actually mention cuckooing, or as Louise was saying, I think it would be great if there was actually a legal power or some sort of legislation that was specifically for cuckooing, so it could take into consideration those vulnerabilities and the kind of holistic approach, rather than it just being totally sort of enforcement led. And with that individual or the tenant who we've already said is most likely to be vulnerable, is then once a closure order is in place, would usually be made intentionally homeless. So is that kind of the cycle that we want to be going round in?
Thank you. Should we have the next slide, please? Okay, so what we're looking at here, some thinking that started to take place in the Task and Finish group that Judith is a part of. And that thinking is really, well, how can we, what can we use already in terms of a skeleton policy and procedure, which actually picks up some of the elements of this vulnerable client group, which we're talking about. And interestingly enough, we're at the moment, we're looking at self-neglect and people who hoard in a different light. And we really felt, as we began to talk more about cuckooing, the fact that some of the main principles of our self-neglect and people who hoard policy is actually very similar. So without wanting to invent the wheel, what we're actually looking at is another policy and a procedure which has a very collaborative approach to it, whereby it might be that the lead agency is not necessarily adult social care, or indeed the local authority. And that's something which we are going to begin to tease out and explore in more detail in the next couple of slides. So a duty to cooperate is something which is something which I am very passionate about. I feel that if you look at the Care Act, the main premise of the Care Act, first principle is the well-being principle. Now, if we all cooperate together, we can actually have a much more holistic approach in order to support an individual person rather than just dealing with aspects of what's affecting them. So in the very first sense of our principles, we're saying a lead agency does need to be identified. And as we begin to look at this client group, we can see that mental health needs to be absolutely part of this new process. Housing needs to be part of this process. And that's not only local authority housing, but also our housing colleagues in the boroughs as well. We also need to have antisocial behaviour, absolutely part of this process. And it goes without saying that in terms of early involvement of the police where criminal activity is suspected, they absolutely need to take priority, and they're very heavily involved already. So we're really going to begin to explore the fact that the lead agency must take responsibility and arrange a multidisciplinary team meeting, certainly being safeguarding head of service. I think this is one of the mistakes that we tend to do. We tend to use email too much as being a way of pulling people together. And nowadays it's just so easy, isn't it? Just have a virtual get together of people around the table who can actually talk, because emails are misleading. They sometimes don't quite nuance what it is we need to do. So a meeting is something which I think is something that very much needs to be on the cards. Without saying also using the principles of making safeguarding personal and empowerment, which is absolutely at the top of those. You put the person at the centre and you actually say to them, what do they actually want to do about this situation? Now, this is a very challenging area. It's a very tricky area of work within safeguarding. It's an area where you need to build up a relationship with trust. And that relationship needs to be based probably over quite a long time in order to actually get a feeling of what the person wants to do truly. And this is something that we need to embed as a culture in all departments. It's something whereby we feel that lead agencies can take the lead role, but there needs to be another governance arrangement behind it, which is really the use of a high-risk panel, but only when needed. So what we're really talking about here is using a similar format to the one that we use within our self-neglect and hoarding protocols, and it's something that Zoe, myself, and the Task and Finish group are beginning to put together. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. What we wanted to do here, and Chloe, I don't know if you want to go first, we wanted to demonstrate a couple of cases which we've dealt with recently within the local authority, so you can get a feel of the type of cases which we're talking about. Chloe, did you want to just talk through the first case study?
Yeah, so this is actually a very recent case in the last few weeks. So if I start by talking about it and then I can explain. So one resident raised concerns to Westminster Housing, who is our main housing provider in Westminster, about loitering and drug dealing in large groups around a particular address. This resident also raised the fact that they hadn't seen a tenant in a few weeks. This was then passed on to the local police. They made a welfare visit, but there was no answer from the address. Westminster Housing actually managed to speak to the tenant of the allegedly cuckooed flat. She sounded spaced out and vulnerable, and was scared but was unable to say why. Although she did then start to disclose that there was a group of men who had been coming to her house, and this had been for a number of years. But she called them her friends. However, she didn't want to get them into trouble. But then on the same, she couldn't get rid of them, and they threatened her. The housing officer, she also disclosed that to the housing officer that she was taking antipsychotic medication. But then we did some checks, and she actually hadn't been seen by the community mental health team since 2017. We thought that was, a little bit strange, just because if she's taking antipsychotic medication, shouldn't she really be more involved with the mental health team? But apparently they can just be given out by your GP. She then disclosed that the medication makes her drowsy, and on one occasion she woke up and there was other people's bodily fluids on the bed, which led her to believe that she had been possibly sexually assaulted. However, she didn't report this to the police. She also didn't want the police involved in the case either. So she was open to being referred to adult social care and other support services, but she didn't want the police to be involved in the cuckooing aspect, or trying to get this group of men to leave her property. We raised a safeguarding referral. So as I said, Louise and I had been working on the cuckooing policy and thinking about how we can work in a holistic way. So as soon as this case came in, I emailed Louise, and we raised a safeguarding referral instead of kind of going down the classic sort of enforcement route, as it were. The outcome of that is that I think Louise mentioned earlier about the eligibility criteria of adult social care. She wasn't eligible for support in that respect. However, it's now being managed as a safeguarding issue from the mental health side. So we've now, or the resident has said that she'd like to move. And as a result of that, Westminster Housing have arranged to meet with her to find out more information about, maybe they can find out the identity of the men, how long it's been happening, and what they actually do while they're in her property, because she has stated that they don't deal or take drugs. However, if she thinks that they're her friends, then, is she covering up for them and not wanting to get them into trouble? The issue of not working with the police has also been raised with her, because in order for housing to complete a management transfer application, the police would need to complete a risk assessment about the property, and so they would need to engage with her. So that's just that's an example of how that case actually moved quite quickly in terms of being referred and having the outcome of the resident wanting to move. Louise, have you got anything to add on that?
Well, I wasn't quite sure when we were going to start looking at some of the questions, but I just wanted to bring up a couple which I saw fleetingly, and I think you said, well, what I think so, what was it raised as from the safeguarding perspective? And those of you who are safeguarding leads yourself will probably be acutely aware that, unless I'm mistaken, cuckooing isn't an abuse type within the legal frameworks. So in fact, you know, it's the abuse here is a psychological abuse. It's very possibly a sexual abuse. But the important thing here is about management of risk. So the safeguarding is actually addressing risk. And there is something else which I wanted to bring up as well, is the fact that I've been throwing the word outcomes around in terms of this talk. And in fact, I should stop doing that, because it irritates me when people do that, because that to me is almost like jargon. Outcomes is meaningless. It's really, what does that person want to do, and how do we know in fact that they actually know what their outcome is? And I think somebody actually popped that up, and you're absolutely right, many service users haven't a clue what they want. So it's about building up a relationship and actually saying, well, you know, this situation is occurring to you. What is it that we can do to support you to get out of this? What is what's your fantasy? Is that realistic? How can we negotiate with you to have an ending where in fact you are in a better situation than you were just before we raised the concern? That's what we're trying to achieve here. Should we move on to the next slide?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I think this is Chloe, were you going to talk to this, or because this is quite an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, this is so this was actually my case that I dealt with over a few months. It was actually raised to me by adult social care, and it was to do with a woman who was 65 years old, who was suffering from early onset dementia, as well as a number of other, I think she had heart problems, and she lives in a 1-bedroom flat. So she'd been assessed by her social worker as having, or as lacking capacity around decision making about housing and finances. A care package was in place, so she had twice daily visits to help with medication and walks. About a year ago, her daughter, or her adult daughter, who's 46, and her grandson moved in temporarily. So this meant, well, a year down the line, so in summer 2020, the tenant was actually still sleeping on the sofa whilst her daughter and grandson had her bedroom. Now, just that is, you know, she's a 65-year-old woman with early onset dementia and other health conditions, and she's been, you know, relegated to sleeping in the sofa, not in the sofa, on the sofa. And the tenant's other daughter, who was actually involved in one of the multi-agency meetings, was quite adamant that her sister was not invited into the flat, or if she had been, it would have been on the fact that it was on a temporary basis. However, this was a year down the line. Thanks. So this had already been raised by the social worker, and then there were also lots of phone calls from neighbours. So it was one of the old Victorian houses that had been divided into maybe 3 or 4 flats, and some of the neighbours had been querying whether there was coercion and around the tenant and her daughter, as the tenant had, for example, if she couldn't do something like top up her electricity, if she couldn't do that, then she would call the neighbour rather than her adult daughter, who should, you know, really be able to help her with that. She would also be saying to the neighbours, to the police, to social services, that she didn't want her daughter and grandson there. And as a result of that, it was kind of concluded that the daughter wasn't helping in the care and support. The tenant was frightened to call the landlord. She thought she'd get into trouble if told police, social services, that she was scared of the daughter. And this was corroborated by her sister at one of the multi-agency meetings that was held. So as a result of that, I think this isn't necessarily a classic cuckooing case that that Louise and I were describing at the beginning. It's more this familial cuckooing where this tenant has been basically coerced into sharing her space with someone that she doesn't want to, but being unable to take control of that situation and getting herself out of it. So, I mean, as a result of that, we sought legal advice from the social services legal team and also the antisocial behaviour legal team. And I think in the end, the daughter did leave, but there was some of the advice was that we could use an injunction to prevent the daughter from re-entering the property on the grounds that she was causing nuisance and annoyance to the tenant. But then there was also the use of coercive and controlling behaviours under the Serious Crime Act 2015.
Yeah.
So that was a slightly different case study.
Yeah, and that's really important. And we need to be bringing things to a conclusion now because we want to spend the rest of the time on questions. Is there anything that Louise or Chloe would want to say before we go to questions?
Well, there's only one last slide, and that's just, I'm not going to say that's just an overview. The last slide basically tells you what I've tried to be telling you already. So it's I don't know if it's going to come up.
Yeah,
so the most important thing is how we can make ourselves accountable.
There we go.
Here we go. So this is what we're trying to do, and I'm very happy to discuss this with any safeguarding leads or anybody else who'd like to use this within their own networks. So we're coming up with a joint cuckooing policy. We're looking actively at having some joint awareness raising sessions and training at different levels for external, internal staff around cuckooing and how to manage it. We're going to ensure that we have everything that we do is evaluated properly. We're going to have a large comms, communication, marketing angle to what we're doing. And we're going to place around this some very strong governance. So the fact that we will be challenged and will be tested out, not only by the Safer Westminster Partnership, but also by the Safeguarding Adults Board. So that's a bit of a roadmap about where we've got to get to. This is not an exact science by any stretch of the imagination. People are complicated. They don't always do what you ask them to do or even taught them to do. So that's all really I wanted to say. And I'm really interested to answer any questions that come up. Perfect.
Thank you. So can we come off slide? Oh, you've done that, Jo. Thanks. So, yeah. So we're going to move to questions now. So please put questions to the chat function. And before we do that, and while everyone's thinking about what we've heard today, I just want to share something personal. And I didn't know whether to share this ahead of time, and I kind of thought I wasn't. Or anyway, because I think it's so important in the conversation, in terms of the conversation that we've just had, I wanted to say that I've got personal experience of a family member being cuckooed, my son, and I spent the month before he died, I spent the weekend with him, with his little puppy. We were watching box sets on television, and then, 4 or 5 weeks later, my son was dead in an environment in which 700 needles were found, in which he clearly didn't have access to his property. There were complaints to the police in terms of noise and antisocial behaviour. So this is personal to me, and it's really important that we find a way forward in terms of, a holistic way forward. These are not victims. Maybe they are, but maybe it's, sinning against and sinning. But, we need to find a multidisciplinary way forward. So that's what I wanted to say before we move into, questions through the chat function. So Louise, Chloe, do you have easy read information on Cuckooing to share with service users?
Absolutely not, no. This is not yet. So you're listening to us coming along. We're formulating our ideas. We'll probably change. I just started to have a look at some of these questions. No, but that's absolutely something we need to do. We really need to engage with service users, ask them if they can actually, by their experience, support us in creating pamphlets. Maybe what we do have though, actually, and because it's Safeguarding Awareness Week, we do actually have a video clip which some service users by experience put together around cuckooing, interestingly enough. We're literally just about to show it on Thursday, when I have asked Chloe to support me in raising the awareness of the week within Westminster. But no, we don't, not yet, but that's on our list of things to do. Thank you.
Oh, great. So we've got one here, question here. Who would you recommend making a safeguarding referral to if you believed a client was a victim of cuckooing?
Well, I mean, if it's a safeguarding referral, you want to follow your normal frameworks and take it straight into the authority.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I would suggest, though, is also putting out some feelers for your community protection organisations as well, such as the one that Chloe, because Chloe, do you want to talk a little bit about your antisocial behaviour referral routes?
That's helpful.
Sorry, there's just someone blowing leaves right next door.
Funny.
Sorry, what was the question?
Chloe, I was actually saying, do you want to quickly talk about your antisocial behaviour referral routes in? So there's a couple of ways which people can actually refer in.
So we haven't, in our policy that we're kind of coming up with or compiling at the moment, we haven't necessarily come to a conclusion about how these cases are going to be referred in. But at the moment, one pathway could be, we've got a referral, an online referral form that we use for our ASB cases that come in. So it could be that they are triaged, they come in that way and then triaged by the social behaviour caseworkers in my team. But I think that needs to be decided in a multi-agency fashion. But that's one thing we're looking at. The case study where I said a safeguarding referral was raised, because it was so new, I think I just sent it to Louise. So when I say it was referred very informally, because we haven't quite worked out how that's going to work. Work.
Yeah. So we've got an interesting one here. I was wondering whether the first study, whether the mental health professionals would be involved, and how how the relocation of a service user impacted the support that she received from multi-disciplinary agencies that she was already familiar with.
So the first question in that was she involved in mental health?
Sure. And the second one, were there agencies that she'd already been engaged with and had built trust with part of that decision?
I think from what I can remember, because she last been involved with the mental health team in 2017. So actually there's been quite a big gap. She seemed quite willing, because it's not actually my case. I just sort of did the bridging of the referral. From what I could work out, she seemed quite willing to be referred for support, but it didn't seem like she had much support currently.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. Louise, do you want to add?
So the other thing I would add is the fact that just because you might have a severe and enduring mental health problem doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually managed within the secondary mental health services. It might well be an excellent GP and a very good wraparound primary care mental health network that can be actually managed through a GP unit. So please don't think automatically that these mental health clients are managed within a community mental health service or hub. They might not be. But I think that's a really important question about recognising the fact that when you are going to be possibly moving someone, you might well be moving them out of their borough. And I think that's why I think that safeguarding is everybody's business, including the local council, because we all need to get together in order to support that person from a holistic perspective. And that combating all those issues that person raised, whether it's health issues, and that whole social response.
Okay, so we've got a number of questions about Cuckooing in Hackney, which is not necessarily the forum to address that now. So we can see all those questions in the chat. So we'll liaise with the City in Hackney Safeguarding Adults Board and try and get a response to those people.
Can I just say something here about time frames? I first recognised that there's a problem with our elderly people and crime probably about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. It takes a long time to build up relationships with directorates or teams you've never met before. You really have to try and find a common ground, and this is about collaborative working. And all I can say is that COVID has really propelled and opened a window on the fact that if we can all work together, not only from a local council perspective, but also from a voluntary perspective, we're actually going to really support these vulnerable adults or any adults an awful lot better. So I can see that Hackney needs to build up its relationship with its antisocial behaviour team. Can I just say something? They're human people. They're humans. So just be nice and pleasant and find common ground.
Yeah. And actually, Hackney do seem to be really engaged with safeguarding and cuckooing and all those kind of things. So I would say please contact Raina, who's the chair, not the chair, the officer support for the City in Hackney Safeguarding Adults Board. So there's one here. So it's something about police, people that are potentially being cuckooed are being told by the police that they can't get involved because there's no evidence of criminality.
Police are telling.
Have you come across?
Is it the police are telling them that they can't get the police?
The police are telling the people concerned that the police cannot get involved because there is no evidence.
I think sometimes, well, if the only thing I can think of is I've had cases in the past where there's lots of antisocial behaviour going on around or in and around near where a property has been cuckooed. But the residents are not reporting. So they're reporting, for example, in the case that I'm thinking of, this went on for 2 years before we actually managed to get a closure order, because the residents weren't reporting regularly to the police or even to us at the local authority. So it meant that we didn't actually have any evidence of, I mean, there clearly was evidence. We weren't saying that there wasn't.
But if there isn't
a legal what's going on,
it's really difficult, isn't it?
Yeah. So without the evidence, the physical evidence and the reports, the police and the local authority actually wouldn't be able to carry something out. However, that might be slightly different in terms of safeguarding. That's I'm just thinking in terms of a closure order and that kind of route. I think it does make a difference if the police don't have reports of issues that are taking place in anywhere, whether it's cuckooing or anything, then they can't increase their patrols. To increase their patrols, they need evidence. So it's kind of that chicken and egg situation. But apart from that, like that pathway, I can't really think of.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And we've got a question here. Potential tenants do not always share all their vulnerabilities for a number of reasons. Absolutely. One of the reasons, I've disclosed my personal experience, but one of the reasons that my son did not disclose was that his little puppy was being threatened. So, if he said anything, they would kill his puppy.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely true. So is there anything you can say on that, or Louise?
From my perspective, I think the only vulnerabilities that we as services get made aware of are, we can check if they're known to mental health, we can check if they're known to social services, we can check if they're known to drug and alcohol services, etc., etc.
But you don't necessarily get a confirmation to those questions, do you?
No. So
can I pick up some issues which I'm seeing in the chat around housing?
Yeah. Oh, fine. Yeah.
So I just want to say that within our task and finish group, we've got excellent response with housing. Now, this does not happen overnight, and I am very interested in collaborative working. It takes a long time to build up relationships with people to actually begin to look at systems. Now, housing in Westminster Housing is doing a piece of work around the vulnerable nature of some of its client group. So it's cross-referencing data with adult social care to see actually, well, who is it who's in receipt of care and support needs. And certainly having done an awful lot of work over in RBKC as well around Grenville, we just didn't know who had care and support needs, who were in the tower at the time. So there are absolutely lessons to be learnt here in terms of a much more collaborative and joint up approach to working with this client group, which is why it's just so great to have Chloe on board, to have police on board, to have housing on board, to have, we have many people on board to try and pull this together. It's not something we've just decided one night to do. And I just, I didn't know Chloe up till, I can't even remember now. I did, but because you have a person in mind and you want to do best by them, you then begin to recognize there's no systems in place to do it. You just begin to build up relationships, and it's then that the systems begin to take form, and that's where we are at the moment.
Absolutely. And it's that multi-agency approach. And there's something else on the chat about it should be local authority and police to gather the evidence once there's been an alert. But it's not that simple, is it?
It's not that simple at all, no. So in fact, I must make sure that everybody's aware. In the Care Act, it says the local authority can delegate to others to collect all that information. There's other. So we need to rely upon tenancy support workers to have that eyes and their ears open to actually who's going in and out of properties. So we'll frequently ask other people to gather the evidence. I must admit, it is the local authority and indeed the police who might coordinate it. That's absolutely without a shadow. But to gather the evidence, we need to rely upon vulnerable sector organisations, tenancy, neighbours, even.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chloe, I jumped in then.
Don't worry.
Anything you want to say, Chloe?
I think, well, on a lot of the cases, so we work, Westminster Housing is our main housing provider in Westminster, but there are other registered social landlords that we work very closely with. However, on a lot of the closure orders that I've done have been with Westminster Housing, and we've just worked collaboratively. And so we've built that evidence base together with then the support of the police. And as Louise was saying, we've got statements from cleaners before and contractors and they're feeding back to us. So it is really about kind of widening who you get that information from.
Oh, for sure. And we've got a comment here. Would be difficult to get a closure order, whether partial or full, where we feel there's cuckooing with antisocial behaviour occurring, and there's an insistence on NOSP being served first. I don't know what that means, and maybe colleagues.
That's a notice of seeking possession.
Okay.
So you would have the process is that you or the housing provider, when our kind of process is that you would, if there was lots of antisocial behaviour going on at the property, you would serve a warning letter, and then if that didn't work, another warning, and then a final warning, and invite the tenant in for interview. And this is what we've done in the past. But a lot of the time when that tenant comes in, you get the ambivalence and you try and persuade that is your property being taken over? And I don't think I've ever really had that many people say to me, yeah, it is, can you help?
Well,
So but after the warning letters, if there's enough evidence, the housing provider would serve what we call NOSP, which is a notice of seeking possession, which is basically saying you're committing, and it would have the grounds on which they're serving that notice. And usually with a kind of crack house cuckooing one, it would be under antisocial behaviour. And you need to serve that before you carry out any legal enforcement. I think mine and Louise's sort of view is that we kind of don't want to get to that stage, because that's my issue with it, is that, if you then go down that route and that vulnerable individual is then on the street, and then you're just in this cycle. So I think it's, you have to serve the notice before you do the closure order, but our aim is to maybe not get that far down that road.
There's a really interesting question here. Whose responsibility is it to collate the evidence for a closure order?
Well, I would say it's collaborative. It's for all agencies that are involved. Primarily, for the closure orders that I've done in the past, it would be myself, the antisocial behaviour case manager for housing, and then we would work jointly with the local police. And we would collate statements, work with the residents. So I would say that, but then there's also work that can be done with if someone's known to support services, can they provide a statement, that kind of stuff. So that is still a joint approach.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's one for Louise here. So why is Westminster Housing not formally on the safeguarding group meetings where others are, like Octavia?
Oh, I'm not certain I quite understand that question. So
I guess it's a composition of the Safeguarding Adults Board, but I'm not sure.
The board we have, we do have representation, but the representation is the director of RBKC Housing, but they actually do an awful lot of work together. So he goes to the board and then disseminates information back. But behind the scenes, I work very closely with Westminster Housing and with RBKC Housing, and then members of the subgroups. Can I just pick up a something which was in the a question somebody asked, and it was about giving a bit more detail about how people are preyed upon, particularly around their medical conditions. So, unfortunately, within safeguarding, you do get to hear about some pretty horrendous situations, particularly where people are not as nice as perhaps we'd like them to be. So there's quite a lot of evidence to demonstrate that you get a lot of people who go around into hospitals and just chat to patients prior to their discharge, just getting a feel of what's going on and just chit chat and befriending them. And in fact, there was quite a few, there was one person in particular a couple of years ago who used to go to St Mary's, and it took about 1.5 years to actually, for the police to join forces and for her to be caught. But she then used to prey on vulnerable older people and befriend them within their own homes. Now, this was something prior to the whole concept of the word cuckooing, when we could broaden the definition. So you do have to ensure that our marketing and our communications stretches out far and wide to raise the awareness, so that nurses or whoever might be working within the hospital environment are actually aware and ask people, who are you? What are you doing here? Do you have a, are you a family friend? So it's really important that we do actually get key messages out for as far and wide as possible, because people are very clever. If they want to get something, they're very clever about how they want to get something.
Absolutely, for sure. Yeah. And there's one here. Oh, can't find it. Sorry, give me a second. In one of the earlier slides, it stated people often look for vulnerable adults around medical out-of-hours practices.
That was it, yeah.
Please, can you elaborate?
Well, that's what I was trying to actually say. I was trying to say actually that, you can get preyed on within the hospital setting.
Yeah.
Chloe, did you want to talk to that one? Because that's something you must have experience about.
That was, there's a surgery that I'm thinking of in particular in the south of Westminster that there's a certain point, I don't know if it's every day but that's when people go and collect their scripts.
Yeah.
So,
yes,
this will often, it's quite, well, for them, it's quite a good place to hang around and choose your prey, I guess. You can follow people home, you can talk to them, you can interact and see maybe who might be a good target. It's really sad, but it's the truth of how people are sought out, really.
Yeah, and all those suckers lists and all the rest of it, which we don't want to hear about those, but they are there.
Definitely.
What's this one, Nikki? Oh, sorry, shouldn't say that. Where's it gone? Give me a tick. Makes befriending services a real worry. Absolutely, I would say. What do you guys say?
I haven't really thought about that.
I think it's a real issue. Speaking personally, speaking as the Advocacy Project, I think it's a real issue. And that's why it's really important that anyone you use as a befriender, a volunteer, or whoever it is, goes through safe recruitment processes.
Yes, exactly.
And even if they're volunteers, they've got to go through the same process, the same DBS checks. That's what I
Yeah,
would say.
Judith, you're absolutely right there. So this again is about us ensuring that we have safer recruitment in place and commissioning arrangements for all those befriended services to make sure that they are very clear about, you know, what they're doing and how they're doing it, and boundary setting. That's important. So, you know, the example I gave about somebody coming into a hospital is a real example, a true example. She wasn't affiliated with any service whatsoever, but it's about raising the awareness when something just doesn't feel right, when it looks wrong. That's what we need to do with our marketing, with our training, with our, you know, with what we're proposing to do across the Bi-Borough.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we've got, if I can find it, one last question, and we're just about to run out of time. Sorry, trying to find it. Something about, community cameras and trying to get evidence for cuckooing, and how important is that? Or is that just, forgive me, I don't mean a knee-jerk reaction, but is it just something that we just do because we know we need to address the issue, but actually cameras outside a building don't necessarily help or record what's going on in the corridors, in people's flats. So, you know, that kind of perspective.
I think CCTV is a difficult one because it's, you know, you've obviously got like data protection, so there's certain instances that you can't record, but also it doesn't, you know, it wouldn't necessarily show what's going on in someone's flat, and you might see people coming and going, but those people might not be the people who are, you know, that they might just be, for example, the drug users who are collecting or picking up. I think if you go down the route of the closure order, the evidence that you need is the impact of the persistent and serious antisocial behaviour on the local community. So the evidence that you would get from cameras shows that, yes, there are lots of people coming and going to this property, but there could be lots of people going to that property and them not making any noise, and the residents are fine about it. And then you know, obviously that person in that flat, if they're being cuckooed, is hugely vulnerable in that situation, but then you need a closure order. So it's, and I mean, in Westminster, the police don't have CCTV, and nor does the council, so you then rely on housing providers to provide it. So yeah, there are pros and cons, I would say.
Right, but I think what we're trying to get across here in this collaborative joint presentation is the fact that pure enforcement action hasn't worked. So it was recognised about a year ago that in fact we need to have more of a collaborative response, and safeguarding does have some excellent soft skills. It comes from a strength-based approach. We want to really pursue assets. We want to really ensure that we are supporting that person as best we can to really, you know, to get them with us together to find a solution to how we can exit them from this problem. So, you know, I mean, I know I don't want to sound glib here, but a problem shared is a problem halved, and that's what this is about. So if we can use talking skills, if we can build up relationships, if we can tackle that whole concept of people who don't choose to engage with adult social services, I'm sure for very good reasons, but by addressing this with our colleagues in the voluntary sector or with another department, then I think we're halfway there to actually trying to find a solution for what is an increasing concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably on that note, because that was such an important point, maybe we should call things to a close at this point. That was, you know, an amazing presentation for both of you, and really thought-provoking, and gives us lots of challenges, lots of things that we can think about moving forward. So perhaps I can say that, you know, that the 150, 160 people that were on this call, if people want to be part of some kind of task group moving forward, please let us know, because these things are really important. So thank you both, Louise and Chloe. Amazing.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you for all the work that you do. And, you know, let's all go out there in National Safeguarding Adults Week and, you know, keep raising those issues, even though they're difficult, and trying to help people stay safe.